All right. Howdy, everybody. How are you?
Good.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear that. It's a beautiful day out here. About 2 weeks ago, we really slowed down on the dry fly action, but we had them until the middle of November coming up to dry, so that was pretty cool. And we're still getting some chubs on dries, so that and trout on streamers. Okay. I do guide down here on the Delaware. I actually started fishing the Delaware back in 1983, and I moved up here full time in 2019. So I've been up here as a full-time resident. I am very blessed. I live right on the river. And before that, I used to come up and fish, a dozen times a year or so. And I also lived on Long Island where I fished some spring creeks and I did a lot of saltwater fly fishing. So the desire for powerful and big fish and challenging fishing definitely helped guide me toward the Delaware because one of the great advantages of freshwater fishing is that you pretty much know where the fish are going to be on a day-to-day or week-to-week situation, whereas in the salt, they can go anywhere. And I really like fish with enormous character and toughness and feistiness, and that can be discriminating, fish like false albacore, salmon, or Delaware River fish, because you definitely earn all of these fish. Now, the Delaware has a reputation for being one of the most technical and difficult fisheries in the country. So when you begin to guide on the river, you really get, because you're not the guy fishing all the time, you get to watch and your observation goes up. And because you're observing so much more, you're able to create a structure for seeing things and for catching fish that when you're the fisherman, you're sometimes not focused on. You're focused on simply catching the fish. But as a guide, you're focusing more on observation to help people catch fish. So the idea of that took about 40 years of fishing this river system. And in the last 2 years, this concept of the underhatch really started percolating in my brain, and how understanding what's going on beneath the surface is really the key to catching when fish are, and I use the quote loosely here, rising. So this presentation is all about really getting in depth on hatches. It's pretty deep, and I hope at the end of the night it helps everybody be a little bit more successful. Everybody who likes to fish dry flies, which is pretty much all trout guys. All right. So in fishing the underhatch, what it's all about is interviewing the trout through observation and understanding. And that'll guide us to choosing the best strategy and the best flies. Now, I literally, the last 2 days, I've been corresponding back and forth with Fly Tire Magazine, putting the finishing touches on an article that I believe will be out in the next issue. I'm pretty sure, whenever the spring issue comes out. And that'll be called Flies for the Underhatch. And this presentation is Fishing the Underhatch. And between the two of them, you got everything completely covered. All right. Now, first thing we got to do is define what this term underhatch is. Well, just like an iceberg, you see about 10% of that above the surface, and there's about 90% below. And you can ask the Titanic exactly what happens when you only pay attention to the piece that's above the water. Same exact thing goes on with a hatch. We see the handful of bugs in the air or on the surface, and there is a moment in time where there's more bugs on the surface. But generally speaking, for the majority of the hatch, as this Dave Whitlock drawing suggests, there are far more insects at the surface and under the surface than on the surface. If you learn to master and understand what's going on just beneath that surface by observation and slowing it down a little bit with the fishing, you tend to catch more fish and you definitely get the bigger fish. Now, what causes this is this area called the meniscus. The meniscus is the top of the water column. If you remember taking science class when you were in school, they had a thing called the graduated cylinder, and you would fill that with a liquid medium. And if you looked at the top, it kind of had like a little bit of an arch to it, and it's a thick rubbery surface. If you put something light enough on it, it can't penetrate it to go down. And likewise, if you're underneath it and you want to break through it and get up into the air, it's very difficult to penetrate as well. Now, we don't tend to think about that because speaking for myself, I'm about 245 pounds and I'm over 6 feet tall. And I certainly hope I have enough body mass and strength to push my way through the water surface. But imagine if you're a size 18 olive or if you're a trico or any other kind of insect. You find that meniscus to be a really, really strong rubbery surface that getting through is very, very difficult. Okay. And here's a good picture of a nymph trying to hatch. And there's a few things I want you to notice here. First off, the vast majority of this nymph is beneath the surface. The second thing I want you to notice is that it's trying to leave its nymphal shuck, and there are gases in that nymphal shuck that are illuminated by the light that's piercing through. And also notice that there are some bubbles up where the insect is starting to go through the wing case to emerge. That's important because we're going to come back to that a little later on when we talk about successful fly designs for this. Now, when the underhatch is thick, you will get some emergers, which is what this is, that are lined up against the surface like this. But it's often the case that the nymphs have to swim from bottom to top multiple times, and they will literally bounce off this rubbery meniscus. They'll hit it, come down a little bit, and then there are gases inside that shuck to help them swim back up again. They'll swim and they literally bounce off it a multiple of times. So all of these insects are trying to emerge, and so many of them are bouncing off of it that you literally have swimming or drifting nymphs all over the surface of the water. And that's oftentimes, much more often, if your river is loaded with bugs like the Delaware is, much more often the fish are focusing on tons of food just under the surface, as opposed to the little bits of food that you and I see above the surface. Now, if you're on an infertile stream, a mountain stream, and you fish a dry fly, the fish might be like, oh my God, look, there's something on the surface because that river doesn't get much of a hatch. And they'll race 2 feet out of their way to go get that bug. That's not the case on really good, robust fisheries. In that case, there's usually very thick hatches and they're not going anywhere. You need to not only consider where they are horizontally in the water column, but where they are vertically. And we're going to talk all about that top 6 inches tonight. So, in the general life cycle of a mayfly, they live as a nymph down here on the bottom. But then this magic occurs that only they understand. There's magic in the world. There's why do fish migrate? They just know. Why do birds migrate? They just know. And why do nymphs know in mass to, hey, today's the day we're going to emerge? Those nymphs will start to swim toward the surface. And when they're swimming up, they eventually hit this meniscus. Now, one thing to note is as they're swimming up, their body has been filling with oxygen. So they get a translucence to them. Okay. Their wing pads are often darkening. And as they're swimming up, they're bouncing off this meniscus time and time and time again. They get exhausted, they get tired, they have to drift for distances. And some of them slowly work their way through. And that's the picture there of an emerging adult. We tend to only think of the ones we see riding on the surface. So much more activities going on below the surface. For example, this is a pseudocloion or a tiny blue-wing olive hatch that we get a little bit in June, but we really get it great in the fall. This is a fall photo right here. Every single little dot on the surface is a mayfly. And if you think this is a lot of bugs, you can only imagine what it's like under the surface. And with all of that food under the surface, the fish, and I'll show you lots of pictures of riseforms later, they're not coming up and breaking the surface. They don't need to. They're feeding just below the surface. You have to learn how to recognize when that's what it is that's going on. Now, does anybody in the room know what this is?
code thing?
Wow.
Is it the code thing?
It is a code thing. Back during World War II, the Nazis had this code that was called the Enigma, and that's the machine that broke the code. Early in World War II, the Nazis were parked right off Long Island, New York City, the east coast of the United States, Boston, the St. Lawrence River. And what they were doing was all of our boats that were loaded up with materials for Europe to help the Allies, they were sinking them all. And also on land with the blitzkrieg operations that they had. We never understood what their armies and navies were doing because we didn't understand it. The Allies, at this point, it was really mostly the Europeans, were getting their butts kicked. But then someone came up with this machine, and all of a sudden, we could translate the Nazi code, and we knew where the subs were, we knew what their battle plans were, and all of a sudden, the tide of the war changed. Well, when we trout fish, if we understand exactly what the trout are doing, if we're able to interpret their movements and what they're looking for, what they're searching for, then how many times have you fished a dry fly and at the end of the day you feel very frustrated? Yet, if you could crack that code, you would be so much more successful. And now we start cracking that code. Too many fly routers jump to conclusions and they go right to the dry fly. If you look at this picture, you'll see a couple of duns up on the surface. They see the couple of duns and they go right for imitating that dun. But if you look carefully at the rise form on the left-hand side of this picture, this rise form never touched the dry fly. This rise form ate a nymph just under the surface. How do I know that? Well, I don't see a bubble in it and I don't see the head of a fish. What you're seeing here is the momentum of a moving fish pushed against the surface and creating an impression. We often call that rising trout. It would be better to be said as bulging trout or boiling trout because the fish are not breaking the surface and they are not eating dry flies. So there are some duns in this picture, but if you look carefully, we have fish trapped in the film. We have cripples. We have stillborns. When you see no bubbles, that's an indication that they're feeding in that top of the water column that you saw in the Dave Whitlock picture that's so loaded with pupa and larvae and nymphs. But again, we get so excited when we see a dry fly or a mayfly dun or a caddisfly adult that we immediately, oftentimes, go right to a dry. And that's a big mistake, okay? We need to learn how to see under the surface to have an idea of what's going on there. And sometimes even when we see what's on the surface and it's thick and heavy, like this batch of stillborn caddis that we get here on the Delaware. Delaware really is an incredible bug factory. The fish still underneath. That was how we caught them that day, not on the surface. Once again, I want to go back to this image from Whitlock because I don't have the underwater photography equipment that can get this photo, so the drawing will have to do. This is where we want to talk about this top section of the water column, just the meniscus down, whatever, 6 or 8 inches, maybe a foot, because that's where the food is going to be concentrated and the trout is going to be feeding heaviest. Now, if you look in this particular picture here, what you're able to see is a handful of rise forms. And if you look very carefully, there are no bubbles and there are no heads. And we're going to get into some video that shows you fish feeding. And we're going to look for how they're feeding and where they're feeding. Now it goes full speed, then I slow it down to half speed, and there's a few different segments of this. Again, no bubbles. Here's the same video at half speed. No bubbles on the surface, no white of a fish's mouth. That one had a head. So of all those rises, only one fish took a dry fly. There's 2 heads popping up above the surface. Now watch what happens. They leave bubbles. When you see bubbles, you know that a head came up. That's because they took in air. That's why there's a bubble. Okay. If you don't see bubbles, they're not taking air. A little bit of play-by-play right there. I got to turn this down because otherwise you'll get noise that you won't like.
Good.
Look at how many of the rings do not have heads, do not have bubbles. If you see a body part and you don't see a head and you don't see a bubble, you don't see white, you don't see a bubble, that means it was a tail that you saw. And what that fish is doing is it's rising and it's turning just below the surface, and the tail breaks the surface, but not the head. Watch what we get here. That was a head dorsal tail. You saw the head break the surface. He took a dry. These are tail slaps right here. These fish are anywhere from a foot to 6 inches under the surface feeding. No bubbles, bulging, rising, slapping tails. That means they're on emergers, wet flies. Now, in this one, you see all these different fish feeding, and so many of them are feeding on different things. There's some of them whose heads you can see. Those fish are taking fish duns off the surface. But the rest of them, like the fish in near, you'll see that those are bulges or boils. Then you'll see some tail slaps in there, and you'll see some heads in there. And this is a live feed. This is the West Branch of the Delaware to the Sulphur Hatch in the middle of the afternoon in July. Okay. Watch carefully as you look for, there's a tail. There's a bulge. Tail slap again. There you got a head. You can see the eye of the head right there. And now you're seeing some bulges. That was a head right there. So when you fish, you really have two options. If you want to target a particular fish, you can switch flies, which is what a lot of anglers do. Or what I often recommend is I don't like to waste time. I definitely don't like to waste time changing flies if at all possible. What I'll change is the fish that I'm targeting. If I have a dry fly on, I'll fish to one who's showing his head. For all the ones that are bulging, I'll fish to with something just slightly subsurface. Here's what you remember. Ready? No white, no bubble, no dry. In other words, if you do not see the white of their mouth or their head, if you do not see a bubble after they rise, do not fish a dry fly. You're going to get frustrated as can be. On the sulfur hatch that happens on the West Branch of the Delaware in the summertime, literally from a little after July 4th, all the way through the first week of August, there will be fish rising from 11:30 or 12 o'clock afternoon until about 4:30 in the afternoon. Then there's a little bit of lull, and there are still some places where fish are coming up if you know where to go. And then at about 7 o'clock, 7:15, 7:30, it starts up again, and it'll go past dark until about 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. So you're getting anywhere from 6 to 8.5 hours of frenetic. You saw the feeds a minute ago. That's how hard these fish feed, just nonstop during the day, because in the Delaware, there are that many fish, number one. And number two, there's that many bugs to get them up feeding. The two go hand in hand. I can't tell you how many times a year I'll be leaving the water, pulling my boat, and the anglers, they kind of come off the water like the Night of the Living Dead or Day of the Dead or whatever it is, like zombies, shuffling their feet going, I casted for 8 hours. I think I had 2 follows. Or I changed flies 37 times today and I still didn't get one. And I think a lot of that has to do with them not understanding by reading rise forms. And there's one other piece of the equation, which we'll get into, exactly what's going on. And if they would do that, the catch rate goes up. This is to show you how big a difference it makes. I had multiple days this year on the boat. Some of the days I was fishing, some of the days really good friends of mine who are outstanding fishermen were fishing, where we had 25 and more trout in a day. And the average people are really happy if they get one or two. I'd say the average day on the river, we typically got 8 to 12 browns in a day, maybe a little bit more, but 8 to 12 was an average day. And a couple of times I hooked it once, and then he's a client, but he's a friend because I really don't, I like to build strong relationships. My buddy Sam, he managed to hook the same fish, and it was so big neither one of us could turn it. All right. So we talked about fish feeding on nymphs. The other piece of the equation is not just to be able to interpret rise forms, but to confirm what the rise forms suggest. You should bring an aquarium net with you, not the little tiny one, the next size up, like 4 inches by 6 inches. And you wait out till you're in the current flow, and you just put that net in the water for 40 seconds, a minute, and look at what's in the net. That'll tell you what the fish are feeding on. And if you look closely here, get everything in focus. I know it's all kind of looks the same. This is all loaded with sulfur nymphs, chock full of them. There's one, another one, another one, another. I think I stopped making these red dots at 10, and I could have made probably another 10. Let me go back to there. Now take a look. You see all these sulfur nymphs in the water? There were no dry flies. Now, yes, a few of these sulfur nymphs, a very few, do manage to get through the meniscus fairly quickly. And you see them on the water, and you see the disturbances on the water. And then the anglers start to think, oh my God, it's dry flies. Great. And they put on a dry fly. But for every single dun on the surface, there's probably 50 to 100 of these nymphs under the surface. And that's what's creating the bulges in the water column. So to really do well, you need to be imitating these nymphs because that's what they're feeding on. And again, nymphs near the top of the water column. Now, here's one of those nymphs, and it's right about ready to hatch. One of my absolute favorite flies in the world, I will introduce you to it in a little while, is called a bar emerger. And you can see if you look at this nymph, the shell, the exoskeleton is just starting to crack. You can see the sulfur yellow just starting to poke through there. All right. This is why that bar emerger is such a great pattern. Now, another point in this, okay, we have some duns on this stuff. By this point in time, we're starting to get some more duns in the seine, and this is over hours of rising. So when I first started fishing the sulfur hatch, and I mean, all right, I'll skip that. When I first started fishing the sulfur hatch, one of the days this year, I go out and there's fish rising everywhere, and there's 12 people on the river. Nobody's touching a fish, myself included. And I then said, okay, let me get out the dip net. And I take the dip net. And the first time I did it, there were no duns in it at all. This was hours before we started to see duns, a good 2 to 3 hours before. And I didn't have my old man reading glasses on that I have on right now. And I seined the water and I picked it up. And the West Branch is a little bit of a dirty river. So I looked at it like, oh my God, all I got is gunk in the net. And I let it go. And I fished for another 10 minutes and nothing happened. So I seined again. It literally looked like there were coffee grinds in the net. But the second time I came up with what looked like coffee grinds, I waded back over to the boat. I put my rod down and I started spreading out what was in the net. I mean, this was thick. Like you could have scooped your hand in here, and I don't know about filled your hand, but you could have filled a quarter to a half of your hand with this stuff that looked like coffee grind. And I looked at it carefully and I went, with the glasses on, oh my God, it's all midge pupa, just like in this picture. You can see all these midge pupa here on the lower left part. It was chock full of midge pupa. They still have all these midges in the water a couple of hours after the midges started to hatch. I tied on a midge pattern. Oh my God, I just started whacking fish right away. So now I take people out, and in the beginning, before I'll put the seine in the water, and if I don't see sulfur nymphs in the water, I immediately turn to midges, and I fish midges on the top, midges underneath the surface, and I do really, really well. And that's how we're able to pad the numbers, because during those first 2 to 3 hours of the hatch when everybody else is getting absolutely nothing. We're catching fish because we're fishing midge patterns. And we'll get into what patterns I like a little bit later. Now, I don't think people always understand typical progression of a hatch. So here's a Hendrickson hatch. I only needed to name a hatch because of the time of day. It's early in the morning. It's 10 o'clock in the morning. And you'll notice that the reddish bar indicates where there's a greater concentration and the bluish bar a lesser concentration. Early on, everything's on the bottom. They're all nymphs. But they are crawling around and they are active and they're getting ready to hatch. That magic thing inside of animals that says, now it's feeling it. And then there comes a point where they start swimming up toward the surface and they hit the meniscus. When they hit the meniscus, and this will last a good hour to an hour and a half of a hatch, when they hit that meniscus, most of the nymphs, not all of them, some of them get through, but most of the nymphs are battling that top 6 inches of the water column, trying to break through that meniscus, and they're having a really hard time. So they try and try and try, and they're unsuccessful. That's what stillborns are. That's what cripples are. They can't break through that meniscus alive. They die trying to do it. Now, there's still some left on the bottom. Okay, that's the lighter line. But they're dominating that top 6 inches of the water column. Now, at a certain point, they start to break through, and they're actually in the film, like the picture I showed you before, if you remember, of the one with the sheen and the shine and the translucence. Now, all of a sudden, you're starting to get a good number of those, still more below the surface, but there's a good number of those. And then the ones below the surface, say at about 3 o'clock, they start to get less and less. And all of a sudden, the ones that are in the film, that's where you're fishing your CDC flies. You're fishing a fly I like called a bum, which you'll see a little bit later with a really good picture to show what it looks like under the water. Now that becomes the main attraction for fish. And then they all start to break through shortly after. And now it's dry fly. So for roughly an hour or a little bit more than an hour, the fish are keyed in on guns. But for all of that time of the hatch, from roughly 3:30 until say 12 and change, for about 3 hours, dry flies are not the way to catch fish during this hatch. Now you can still fish up in the water column, and that's what we're going to show you in a few minutes. But if you fish dry flies before this moment right here, you're handicapping yourself because most of the fish in a river system that has a good, strong population of bugs, most of the fish are feeding hard on that underhatch. And then, of course, later in the day, the fish come back as spinners, or the bugs come back as spinners, and the fish feed at the surface. All right. So quick little video here. Count the rises overall, and then count the number of heads that you see. All right. So that you know, there were 14 rises. I watched the video a bunch of times to count them, and there was one head. So this was early in the hatch. 14 fish rose, and look at how 14 fish rose in what? 15 seconds? And one of them took a dry fly. The other 13 fish subsurface. So if you're not targeting subsurface, you're making it very difficult on yourself to be successful. There's the one fish that rose. All the rest of these rise forms, they're all subsurface. Okay. You can see here the difference between a head and a tail. Here's your head. Here's a tail. When the rise forms, when the fish disappears, you'll see a bubble with the head, and there will not be a bubble with the tail. You take a look here. This is a friend of mine, Tom, fishing. So the nearer rises, you'll see there's no bubbles. And in the farther rises, we got some bubbles. So that's the difference. If you throw a dry fly to these farther rises, you got a shot at catch them. But if you throw it to these fish that are closer, you're not going to catch. They're not even looking at it. It's not that they said, oh, I don't approve of the color of your dry fly, or your dry fly should be a different size, but that's what people do. They'll say, oh, it must be another bug, or oh my God, it must be a size 16 instead of a 14, or oh my God, I have the wrong shade of yellow. No, they're not even looking where your fly is. You need to be under the surface, or you can not target that fish, and then you can go for the ones with bubbles. So, understanding all of this information, how do we develop a working strategy toward being really successful with the hatch? Well, the first thing you do is you interview the trout by reading the rise forms. That'll give you a huge sense of direction. Then you sample the water with the dip net. And what you want to do is see, okay, I can tell by the rise forms that they're under the surface feeding. Well, what are they feeding? Unlike the surface, you can't see under the surface, but the dip net can see for you. Then you select the flies or a setup, which we'll get into, that are going to be successful for that slice of the water column, be it on the top or underneath, and the particular bug that's hatching. And then you adjust it as necessary to the information the trout and the dip net provide. Many times during this hatch on the West Branch, there will be, say, 40 minutes or 50 minutes of absolute insanity, crazy feed. And then there'll be a little lull. And then it'll start up again. And then there'll be a little lull. And each time there's a little lull, if you put your dip net in the water, you'll see that what's in your dip net's changing. So you have to use that information and process it to say, okay, oh, they're switching from midges to emerging sulfurs now. Or, oh my God, the emerging sulfurs, I can see them all. Look at them. All of them have their wings partly sprouted. They're in the film now. I got to go with something like a bum or a RS2. So all of that information will dictate where you go with your fly selection and your presentation. So when we're doing this, yes, we're on midges, and some of the fish are small, 10 inches, 12 inches, but nowhere near all of them. The average fish we're getting is, I would say, anywhere from 14 to 17 or 18 inches. This was actually an 18-inch brown. It doesn't look like it, but it really was. And when I landed this fish, I hooked it. I was alone. I don't fish if I have clients on the boat. But what was really cool is it was like copper when I was fighting it. And I'm looking at this fish, and it's like taking my breath away. It's so beautiful. And it just so happens a guide without anybody in his boat was coming behind me. And I said, do me a favor. Can you just anchor up, and please, if I get this fish in, because it was on 7X, if I get this fish in, can you hold it for some pictures? So I was able to get the pictures, and I'm very thankful to the guide for saying, sure, I'll hold it for you. This is that guy, Sam, I told you about before, who also lost that one big fish, doing really well. And again, this is the average fish that we're getting on these flies between the midges and the sulfurs are anywhere from a size 16 to a size 22. This is Bo Beasley, if you ever heard of him. Bo just wrote the book that came out about Project Healing Waters and how it impacted soldiers. And I strongly suggest, if that's a matter dear to your heart, that you read it. It's an excellent book. But there's a funny story that goes with this picture. Bo came up, spent a couple of days with me to fish the Delaware or the West Branch. The first day we fished the main stem, and we did well with smallmouth. Bo's fished for a lot of smallmouth, but he had never fished the Delaware and the West Branch sulfur hatch, which is an entirely different beast. I already told you how hard this hatch is for a lot of people. And Bo turns around, and in the whole morning session with the midges and everything else, he had landed 4 fish, which isn't bad. I mean, it's better than most people did, but it's not typically what we do. And I kept saying, well, Bo, you're having a good day. You really are. You compare yourself to most of the people on the river. How many people did you see with a bent rod all day long? And he's like, no, I'm letting you down. I know you want pictures, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, Bo, I'm telling you, you're doing really well. And he's feeling really bad for himself. So I decided to call up my buddy, Eric. And Eric has a degree in counseling. So I know Eric will say just the right thing to calm Bo down. His name is Eric Lind. But I call up Eric, and I go, and I want to have him talk to Bo. Eric's not home. Then the young man, if he's still there, who went to trout camp, one of my best fishing buddies is this guy, Brian Walensik, who was at the camp that week. He and I fish together a lot. We're really good friends. In fact, I was talking to him before today. And Brian, I figured I'll call up Brian because Brian's like this really compassionate, easygoing guy, and he'll make Bo feel better. So I call up Brian. Brian's not home. I'm like, oh my God. So then I have to call up my mentor on the river. His name is Mike Bachkowski. He's an amazing fisherman, but he used to play Division I college basketball. And if you know what like bench jockey humor is, he he's just sharp-witted with his tongue, and he's not delivery, nice guy, not his strength.
Yeah.
So you got to have thick skin dealing with Mike. So I call him up and I said, Mike, I got my buddy Bo here. He says, yeah, bud. Okay. All right. So I said, listen, Bo's been fishing the West. He's been fishing it for the afternoon hatch of sulfurs. He's got 4 fish, and I'm telling him he's doing pretty good. And he's telling me I'm just trying to make him feel better. He goes, give the phone to Bo. So I give Bo the phone. And Bo turns around and he says, hi, Mike, nice to meet you. He goes, Bo, listen, he says, stop fishing right now. He goes, why? Bob says they're going to keep hatching. He says, they are. But listen, you just drive with Bo, Bob, back to Calicoon. We have a tattoo shop here in town. I want you to undo your belt, drop your pants, stick your ass out, and have the guy tattoo the date on your ass because nobody catches 4 fish the first time that they fish the sulfur hatch on the West. So I thought that was pretty funny. And I like to include that story. But he wound up catching 3 more that night. So he did really well. He wound up with 7 for the day. So I said, okay, Bo, you did a nice job. We get 20-inch fish feeding to this hatch during the day. That was taken a little before dark, so the fish is kind of fuzzy, but that taped in at like 1/8 of an inch over 20 inches. And these techniques, they don't only apply to the Delaware. Delaware is my home water, so that's where I'm getting the photos and doing the fishing. But this is a spring creek back home on Long Island filled with wild brook trout. It works on those. In fact, this is where I first started developing them. This is the Farmington River. This is the Upper Connecticut River. And this is the Rapid River up in Maine. In all of these waters, any watershed that has a really strong, healthy population of bugs, these techniques are necessary to do really well. You'll be almost as good a fisher as the flock of mergansers that drives you crazy.
Yeah.
All right. So again, mayflies. We're just going to tweak this approach for the different species of bugs that can hatch on the surface. So mayflies is the first one. If you don't recognize it, that's a Hendrickson, which is a really great time of year to catch good fish. Now, the number one technique that I like to use, and hopefully a bunch of guys in the club use, is the dry dropper. Now, I'm not talking about what they do out west when you put a chunky Chernobyl on and a beadhead stonefly. I'm talking about fishing a dry fly like a parachute, because I love parachute flies, or a comparadon, and 12 to 18 inches down, I put some kind of an emerger. This happens to be a bar emerger, and I'll show you pictures of them coming up a little later on. I have a whole section on flies. Now, the dry dropper is wonderful because you both cover the surface and you cover that top 6 or 8 inches of the water column. When you tie your emergers for this, like a bar emerger, do it on a dry fly hook. You don't want it sinking too far below the surface. When I tie them on heavier hooks, I don't do as well. You want to keep it on a dry fly. When do you do this? If you see splashy rises, because that means they're turning at the surface and you're seeing the tail. Bulging rises, that means you're just seeing the momentum disturb the surface. If you don't see bubbles, that's when this dry dropper is super deadly. And I can't see a show of hands right there, but I'll summarize what happens with virtually every club I present to. If I ask, is there anybody in the club who fishes a dry dropper like this? Hands usually go up, anywhere from 2 or 3 people to 15 or 20 people. And then I'll say, how many times when you get the strike would you swear that the fish took the dry fly and you end up seeing the emerger in the corner of his mouth? It happens all the time, constantly happens. Okay. The other thing that's pretty cool about it is, most of us started fishing when we were young. And we started with a bobber and a worm for sunnies, or in my case, it was a bobber and a piece of shiner for a snapper. And, we harken back to when we were a little kid and the bobber would disappear under the surface. And sometimes the fly's just drifting along and your dry fly just disappears. You never even knew there was a rise. Nothing to give away a rise at all. And what he did was he took that emerger and pulled the dry fly under the water. So it can act like a bobber as well. Now, this is what it would look like if I tied it on a leader. Okay. I love a knot called a Davy knot. Gotta be careful when you tie it, but it's a great knot. Um, and I tie that to the head of the fly, and I tie a clinch knot to the dry fly. One thing to be careful about, if you don't have a barb on the dry fly, sometimes the leader will slip off. So maybe fishing a barbed dry fly. Barbed dry fly will definitely save that from happening. And you just change it based on the hatch. There's another hatch we get here in the fall called the Lucretia or Heptagenia hebe. And all I do is change the colors of the flies and the size of the flies so that it's successful during that hatch. And just like the old toothpaste commercials, 4 out of 5 trout surveyed prefer the dropper. That's about the ratio I get. 80% of the fish that I catch will be on the dropper compared to the dry. That's how much they prefer to feed on that just under the surface water column. And I don't usually take pictures of fish like this. This fish was caught 5 years and a month ago. This is the very first brown trout I ever caught in my drift boat. And it's right at 20 inches long. And it took a little tiny size 22 emerger. So big fish will take these flies. This is going to show you how to put the whole package together. I have a dry dropper on here. It's going to show you a reach cast, which we talked about last year during my presentation. And you're going to see a little bounce back, put a little slack in the line to give you a drag-free drift to the fly. Also, every time I ever try to catch a fish on a dry fly or a dry dropper, I always like the first cast to be a little short because I don't want to spook the fish. I want to know, I want to see what the drift looks like. I want to get my distances down. And then the second cast is the one that I try to catch them on.
Let's fly about to drift through.
Fish is rising right off of the tip of that rock, down about, I don't know, 8 or 10 feet.
A little bit short on that cast, but this is my first cast in this spot, so I like that.
There he is.
Notice, remember we talked about breaking it down? Look at this.
There's your reach cast.
Right off the tip of that, we got a little bit of a current going right over them now. Boy,
Oh,
somebody should
slack,
come
you
up
can
and
see
say
the
hello.
slack in the line. No drag here at all.
Come on, come on.
There it
There
is.
we go. Look at that. Bingo.
Okay. That's the strategy. That's how you want to do things. Dry dropper, present it to a rising fish, just like you would a dry fly. Don't change a thing. And 4 out of 5 times he's going to have the emerger in his mouth. If you had just fished the dry fly, a lot of times you're not going to catch that fish. Works everywhere, like up here on the Rapid River in Maine. Fish took the dropper. Here's another picture of a fish that took the dropper. And this is my personal best out of the Delaware River system on a dry dropper combo, a 22 3/4 inch brown. And as you can tell, he approves of the dropper. All right. Really healthy, wonderful, strong fish. These wild fish, they really do prefer to feed just underneath the surface. They were raised in the water column. They feel safer feeding underneath that surface. You'll get better fish feeding down there. Here's a Spring Creek on Long Island. Those are those little tiny brook trout, but wild. And you can see the bar emerger. That's a Hendrickson bar emerger in the corner of his mouth. Now, I want to go back to an idea I began to mention earlier. But if you look here, you can see all of the bugs on the surface. Now imagine all of the bugs under the surface. And you really got your work cut out for you to catch fish during this particular situation. And then on top of that, you can tell by the sizes here that we have multiple species on the surface. There are, in fact, 4 different mayflies, one of which is the green drake, coupled with you got 4 dung types on the surface. Then you got everything under the surface. And if you look carefully here, the near rise has a bubble, so that fish took a dry. To the left of it, there's no bubble. That fish was under the surface. And it's a little hard to tell what's going on the splashy rise. I don't think it took a dry fly. I think that's a tail, but without a little more information, it's hard to tell which is which. Delaware River. Boy, oh boy, you get fantastic hatches down here. Now, if you look here, you can see just the tail sticking out of the water. This fish never showed its head. This fish is feeding on nymphs, yet so many people would rush to put up a dry fly. If you see bulging, tailing, or rocket launches, that happens a lot, like say a half hour before the hatch. You just see a fish jump clear into the air. All right. Those fish are on nymphs. The one that jumped clear in the air is chasing one up from the bottom. The other ones are getting them when they're close to the surface and they're stuck against the meniscus. Again, another one. If you look carefully at this particular picture, that's the head of the fish. It never broke the surface. There's the dorsal fin right there. Again, nymphing just under the surface. That's what you call a porpoising trout. When you see dorsal fins and tails, dorsal tail, what you're looking at is fish feeding on nymphs at the surface. And that's where you want to fish a nymph, just under the surface. That's the key to success. On the other hand, if you see heads and bubbles, now they're taking duns, feel free to fish your dry flies on top. You will be successful. Just because you see a dun doesn't mean that's how you should fish. You have to check out those rise forms. Now, with caddis flies, how do you go about with caddis flies? Well, it's pretty much the same thing. There's this impression, the Bible's gospel. Fly fishing books are not. And myths can be propagated through fly fishing books. Early on, there was this myth about how the caddis was the super insect and it could rocket through the meniscus the first time it bounced off the bottom. And it's just completely false. Gary LaFontaine came out with his epic work, Caddis Flies. And if you don't have that book, you really should get a hold of it. And he said that he watched them emerge. It took 30 seconds to a minute, sometimes 2 minutes, for the caddis to be able to break through the meniscus. Yet there was this impression that caddis flies were able to go through because they often generate a splashy fly, a splashy rise. And by the way, so do mayflies. So just because the rise is splashy doesn't mean it has to be a caddis. So you set your caddis up the same exact way, okay? There's what your caddis looks like so you can recognize them and know what it's doing. And there are some great caddis rivers out here. Again, your approach is the same. Dry dropper, everything is the same. You'll get fish, more fish will take it in the corner of its mouth, 80% of the fish. The dry fly will just disappear sometimes. Some of the really good rivers for caddis flies. And some rivers that aren't so good for mayflies are excellent for caddis flies. This is the Lackawaxen in Pennsylvania. Really nice fish in that river. Good river to fish. The Rapid up again in Maine. That's a really good caddis fly river. Much better caddis than mayfly. Delaware again. Delaware's great with all of them. Now with caddis, things are a little bit different. Dry dropper works great, but caddis are a little more active. They do swim more. They tend to pump their legs more than you would with a mayfly nymph ascending to the surface. So this is where swinging wets and soft tackled flies are really effective. Whereas with mayflies, they're still effective, but they're particularly effective with caddis. Here's my buddy Sam fishing just across a flat, and he's covering water with a soft tackle. You can see his rod is bent. He's fighting a fish in there. Just swinging soft tackles across because we had a caddis hatch on this particular day. So caddis hatches do really, really well with swinging wet flies, soft tackles. And again, we'll get into patterns in a little bit. Riffly fast water, excellent. Just searching with stonefly nymphs. Pardon me, I said stonefly nymphs. It's good for that too, but caddis pupa up near the surface. Now, I have to give you a disclaimer here. I am not Steven Spielberg, and I don't make the best videos in the world. So I had meant to make a really good swinging wet fly video, and I'll probably make another one next year. But it was just, when I have people out on the boat, I don't want to use them to make videos for my purposes. They're paying for the day, so it's their day to catch fish. So I kept putting off making videos on how to swing wets and another step with wets in a few minutes. So I said, okay, I better do this. So like in the first week of November, I said, okay, we still got some dry fly action going on. Let me go out there and go make some of these videos. Unfortunately, I didn't realize at one point that my sunglasses slipped over my GoPro. So for part of the 2 videos coming up, it's not exactly great looking, but you will get the point about what you should do. Now, the basic wet fly swing, the things to understand or remember is you want to fish down and across. You want to adjust the speed of your fly, and that might take some changing. Sometimes, you go from one speed to another and you start catching fish. Keep that speed up. Lead the fly with the rod. That's very important. And impart some action on that fly as it often triggers a strike. Okay. And I'll give you the play-by-play as I go through this video here. So to show you how effective this is, I went down to the river and I took 4 casts. And in 4 casts, I caught 3 fish on these wet flies. The supposedly impossible Delaware. So there's your down and across cast. And here's the action. I give it a little bit of action with a little pump rod, and I'll also do a little finger twist retrieve or just pull the line a little bit because the caddis are active and the fish do respond to a little bit of an active fly during this. Not crazy active. And if you don't get fish to a little bit of action, you can try no action or you can try a lot of action. Okay. There's a little bit of a mend to adjust the speed. I didn't want the fly whipping through the water. Again, a little bit of action. You could see me. Sometimes my left hand will come up here. There it is. You see, I'm just working that line a little bit, little hand twist retrieve. It's swinging right in front of the trout now. And bingo. Okay. So that shows just the basic swinging of the wet technique and how easy it is to fish that way and catch fish. I've been doing this since 84. The reason I said 84 and not 83 is the first year I fished up here, I didn't catch a single fish in about 8 trips. So since 84, I've started to catch fish. Don't forget, cast down and across, adjust your speed, either mend it or put a little loop downstream, either an up or downstream mend. If you want more speed or less speed, lead the fly with the rod and impart a little bit of action. Okay, the fish really respond to it with the wet flies. And I like to do it with caddis pupas, which we'll show you in a little bit. Now, that's, again, the basic wet fly swing. But, oh, why is this happening again? I'm wondering if this might be the one where I target the fish. Let me see here. Yeah, that's what, yeah, I targeted the fish. I cast it just upstream of the fish. Lead with the fly. I'm literally fishing that nymph 6 inches under the surface. This might be the same video from before. I'll find out in a minute if I don't hook one that goes ballistic and starts flying all over the water. Oh, but also my glasses didn't. Oh no, I think this is it. No, that's the same one as from before. I don't know why that one came up. Well, hopefully we'll get to the other one in a minute. Just to show you how important this wet fly technique is and not to disregard it. Rick called me up one day. He says, Bob, I want to take you out on September 16th. I go, okay. And this was like a week before. He goes, it's my birthday. Are you open that day? I said, yeah. He goes, good. My wife said I can go fishing. We fished, we drifted 5 miles of the river and we didn't see a bug. We didn't see a hatch anywhere. And then we got to this stretch, which is really good looking wet fly water. And in 100 feet of river, he had 10, I forget if it was 10 or 12 rainbows in. Really good fishing. You could see the soft tackle in the corner of the mouth. Nice, plump, strong, powerful fish. If you fish anything lighter than 4X, they'll definitely break you off. Sometimes you need to go to 3X. And again, anywhere you have open water like this, where you can cast and let it swing, it's a great way to catch fish. Okay, so here's the second video that I was really looking for. I must have went backwards on my key before. That's why that happened. Okay, now this is a technique that separates good from great. If you learn to do this, you will become a great fisherman. I don't know how many people in the club have ever fished the Delaware before, but it's notoriously difficult to catch fish on dry flies upstream in the Delaware. You could do it, and we get some, but we get a lot downstream, down and across. We do not get a lot upstream. But if you fish a wet fly, you can do really, really well. So here's a video of fish rising across stream from me, and I present a wet to them just like you would present a dry fly. The difference with this is you want to keep contact with the fly, lead it. Don't put quite as much action on it. If the fish rises to the fly in the area where you think your fly is and you don't feel anything, sometimes you'll feel it. But if you see a rise in the area, just lift your wrist. Don't lift your whole arm. Just lift your wrist a little bit. And when you lift that wrist, okay, if you feel weight, drive it all the way through to the shoulder. But if you don't and you miss and there's no weight there, all you did was move your fly a couple of inches. And remember, they like that with caddis. So you could trigger a strike doing that. All right. Here is the video. Okay. Here's my Steven Spielberg moment with us. I took my Polaroids off and I didn't realize they were blocking my GoPro. So there's the fish rising across the river. A little mend to adjust speed. I'm leading the line with the rod, a little bit more of a mend. Leading, leading, leading. All right, I'm getting close to where they were rising here. Bingo. There we go. Fish on. Remember, I had 3 fish and 4 casts doing this when I needed to make these videos before the end of the year. Here's another thing too. It was a pretty windy day, yet I still managed to catch 3 fish on 4 casts.
And you got yourself a nice little brown trout.
Okay, again, another fish continued to rise right in the same area. So I made a cast. He was just a little bit more downstream. Okay, feeding line. I'm not moving it here. I'm feeding it to him. Now it starts to swing. Now I'm giving it just a little action right in front of his nose so he can't say no.
Might have been after mine. Here we go. Oh, look at that rainbow take to the sky. Whoa, whoa, look at that go. Oh, look at that. Oh, 5 jumps. Oh, 6, kind of 5.5 there. Oh, look at him come up again.
So this is a very old British technique of fishing wet flies upstream or across stream and fishing the wet fly
Oh,
to
it's
the
a
rise.
brown.
And it is a deadly, deadly,
One
deadly
brown. You
way
don't
to
want
catch fish.
brown over 2 weeks.
All right. So once again, to summarize this technique, you target the rise form. You cast to it the same way you would cast to a dry fly to a rise form. You cast above it, you know, get your drift down pat. You might want to reach cast. You might want to put a little mend in it. Then as you're raising that rod up, just like you would contact nymph, but you're doing it in the top 6 inches of the water column. And then again, it's zone striker feel. If you feel the fish pull on that video, I felt the fish pull. You'll feel that a lot, but sometimes you won't, and you'll see just a rise form in that area. Just lift your wrist. As you lift your wrist, if you feel weight, drive it through to the shoulder. If you don't, just lift the wrist and just keep working the fly, working the fly, working the fly, because you gave it a little bit of movement, and that can attract the trout when they're feeding on caddis. It can on a mayfly too, but it really does on a caddis. Okay. Again, old school British way of fly fishing. This method, this used to be the popular way to fish a nymph. In fact, it was the only way allowed on British chalk streams in the early 1900s. And as I mentioned before, it's a really good way with the big fish. Now, the other thing that you should understand about this technique is this is how people catch massive Atlantic salmon. Okay. I mean, they might not be targeting a rise form, but there's something very innate about fish that respond to this. So fish from the time they're little babies, they know to feed just underneath the water, the top of the water, that top 6 inches of the water column, 8 inches, and they look for it up there. This is a trip to Labrador. I've been up there many, many times. I've landed about 70 Atlantic salmon, and in those 70, every one of them was caught right at the surface with a fly swinging across the surface, just like in the videos with the trout a minute ago. But it also works for a midge. Again, same exact thing. Tie to the bend of the hook, let your dropper hang down. And this is a typical size fish during that midge part of the hatch that we're landing. But again, sometimes because you have 7X on, you lose fish that are beasts that you never turn. But we also get some really nice ones, like this guy. And the midge pupa, knowing to go to the midge pupa means we're catching these fish when other people are not catching them. That was caught on a midge pupa. Another fish on a midge pupa. This is one of my favorite fish of the whole year caught on a midge pupa. That's Rick. He called me up one day. He said, I want to take my son out for the day. He said, don't worry about me fishing. Just take him, have him catch fish. I just want to sit back and watch. So if you remember before, I told you with those summer sulfurs, there's a little bit of a lull. And during that lull, there's places you can go and the fish are still sipping on the surface or just under the surface. And we saw this fish just ever so subtle, just under the surface. And we put on a little midge pattern. And the young man's name is Xander, short for Alexander. And he wound up getting the 17-inch brown on 7X tip. And it's a nice, chunky, fat fish. So recognizing these opportunities really adds to the fishing day and the experience. The key, reading rise forms, having a dip net. One last technique, and this is pretty cool, lifting your streamer. So I had a guy take me out who I'm becoming friends with, who might be in your club. Chris Nentars is his name. So if he's in the club, great. I know he comes from the Buffalo area. And we went out, and it was miserable conditions. And we were going to start the day fishing streamers. And I took one cast to show him how to work a streamer. And I said, as I was saying the words, and always work your streamer up to the surface like it's rising to a dry fly. Slam. This brown trout came out and slammed into the dry, and we hooked him and landed him. The only cast I took the whole day, I think. And he came after it. It happens so often that if you finish your streamer, like it's coming up to take a dry, it triggers something in the trout, and they really like to go get it. Walleye love it. Landlocked salmon love it. Big brown trout love it. Rainbows love it. They all respond to this. You fish your streamer, you get it in, you get it close, and at the end, just, oh, look at this, like a Liza ring lift. It's coming up to the surface. And the trout go bam, and they slam your fly right up at the surface. Smallmouth respond to it even. And my favorite fly for doing it is this fly called the briny muddler. It's just, I love deer hair flies, and it's really effective pretty much anytime, but particularly as it pushes water coming to the surface. Okay. Now, we've talked about the phenomenon, understanding, reading rise forms, using a dip net, even the oddity that the fish will chase bigger fish, any size fish. If they see another fish rising, they'll chase it down and eat the fish that's rising with your streamer. And how often have you heard a giant kablunk in the middle of a hatch? That's what's going on. Now let's talk a little bit about flies that get it done. The first type of fly that I really like as my dry fly when I go mayflies is what I call a parashuck. It's just a parachute with a shuck out the back. Floats really, really well, minimal maintenance, and the fish will still take it as a dry fly. It's a very effective fly fished alone, but fished in this combo, super deadly. The next fly that I really like is called an unusual. It's pretty much like a usual with a couple of changes. First off, the tail is made out of snowshoe rabbit, the foot. And the body is whatever the comparadon would be, okay? So the real usual, the whole thing is rabbit foot. But in this case, the body is actually made out of whatever you would use to imitate the mayfly. And then you got your comparadon. All of those work very well as dry droppers or fished alone when the time is right to fish them alone. This is a fly I mentioned before called a bum. Okay, a bum is a really good fly. My buddy John Haig named it for me because I was fishing it so often. He goes, "Oh, that's the bum." I said, well, "What's a bum?" He goes, "Bob's usual merger." And all it is this little tiny tuft of snowshoe, very sparse, and that will hang this fly just under the surface in that area we were talking about. So here's a picture of it. You can see that it's just under the surface, exactly where all of those mayfly nymphs or caddis nymphs or midge nymphs are popped up against the surface. And you can see that the sheen is being imitated really, really well. Good fly. Now, talk about fish feeding just under the surface. In the photo on the left, if you look carefully, it was taken from a long way away. You can actually see the mouth of the trout as it's taking in a fly just under the surface. You can see the bulge. You can see the boil. There's not going to be a bubble left on this one. And there's the fish a moment later, and all you saw was his dorsal fin as he turned to go back to the bottom. Read that rise form. There's a tail. If you learn to do it, you'll be really successful. Now, oh, look at that. I'd never noticed that with the bar emerger before. I got to correct that spelling. Bar emerger is a great fly. I will not be without this fly on the Delaware. If you ever want to know what's a really good pattern, go into guides fly boxes and open up and see whichever flies there's just a million of in the box. And in mine, you would see that for the bar emerger. What this is everything from behind the thorax, from the abdomen to the tail. It looks exactly like the nymph would look. And everything above that looks like the dun would. So that's the colors of the dun just starting to pop out, like that picture of the sulfur starting to pop out. The wing case, where the wings are starting to form, all you're doing is tying it exactly the way you would tie a nymph and then folding it back. Tie it off and then trim it so you have the beginning of a wing bud. Okay. If you want to know how to tie any of these flies, if you go to my website, fliesforfish.com, then you can, there's video links and you can see how to tie all the flies through the videos that are available on there. Soft tackles, excellent choice. I love fishing soft tackles. Really, really, really good choice. This is one that I call a Solaris soft tackle because Solaris is used in making of the body. And this will be the bar emergers featured in the upcoming fly tire. This fly is, in fact, a lot of these flies are. All right. Now, when you get to caddis, I like to fish a fly called a parachute caddis. I use a snowshoe wing or a deer hair wing and a parachute again because it floats so well across the surface, or an iris caddis. Iris is awesome. And with the iris caddis, the only thing that'll get trapped in the film is this loop of Zelon on the top. Everything else sits in or under the film. So again, this is right at the meniscus. That's where this fly targets. It's a really good pattern. In fact, until Memorial Day last year, this fly caught more fish for me out of the Delaware, more dry fly fish, than any other fly. The LaFontaine Sparkle Pupa is another really good one, but I think it's a pain in the butt to tie. So I have a little simplified version of it that I call the Main Points Pupa. And what you're getting is that same translucence, but I simplify it a little. I just do a quick little body here, a little thorax, and a little bit of soft tackle in there. And the fish really like this fly. It's a very good pattern. You just change the colors based on whatever the hatch is. Okay. And the last caddis pupa I would strongly mention for any person is a fly called the taboo caddis. This is an excellent fly. For years, I tried not to fish it because I didn't think it would work because it doesn't fit with the classic LaFontaine model, the translucence and the sheen, but it really works. This is a great pattern. It's really wiggly in the water. Very worth getting to know. And again, all of these patterns are available on the website with links on how to tie them. Serendipity is another good one. Fish just below the surface film. Really good pattern. Lastly, for midges, people say, what patterns do you use? 99% of the time, the midge dry fly I use is the Zelon midge. It's from Blue Ribbon Flies. It's really simple to tie. It floats like a cork. And it doesn't really matter what I think of it. I don't know what I think of it. What I know is the fish like it. So I keep fishing it. And then as far as the pupa, again, there's a lot of patterns out there. I haven't had anything come close to being as successful as this is. I call it a no-name pupa. I'm sure people tied it before I did. I have no idea what the name of it is. And all it is a little white bead, because that's really important in a midge because it imitates the gills. And then it's a piece of flashabou tied to the bend and back, a little bit of Solaris coating it, and just a couple of little sparse turns of peacock curl. And when you get all of that down pat, you'll be as good a fisherman as the herons on the river are.
Mhm.
So these are the secrets that I have found through 40 years of fishing up here, particularly highlighted since I started guiding a while back. It's a really good way to catch nice fish, big fish, and good fish. So you have this system now where you can fish horizontally across the river and find rise forms, but also vertically up and down in the water column. Remember, wherever you see foam, there's going to be fish. And then you can crack the code of the enigma of where the very good fish are going to be feeding, and a good idea of what they're going to feed on with the dip net and the rise form. Once you get that figured out, you put on the appropriate pattern, you'll know what flies ought to work and when, and then you put it all together so that it makes sense. How do we arrange the elements before us? So a lot of people, they make a really big mistake when they go fishing. And I've said this a couple of times. They see rising fish, they call it, and they put on a dry fly. It's a really big mistake. You got to process all of this information, the rise forms, the dip net, everything else, your experience with the river, and say, how do we best go about doing this to maximize our production, to do as best as we can? Well, in photography, there's this guy named Sam Abell, and I try to take a good picture. I'm learning how to become a better photographer. And one of the things he taught me through his work is the first thing you do is compose the scene. Then you wait for the subject, the magic moment. So here he composes the scene. And then look, he's got the shadow on the tent to really make the moment work. Or, oh, I have a nice little composition here, but boy, oh boy, did that turn into a great picture when the dog turned around.
Yeah.
So you're out there fishing and you start interpreting what you're seeing. How are the fish rising? What's in the dip net? Where's the foam line be? What area in the column, vertical water column, should I be fishing? Then you start saying, okay, now I can go for the magic moment. Now I'll pick the right fly, as opposed to picking the fly just because you see fish rising. First, compose the scene when fishing. What are the bug species? What are the conditions telling you? For instance, if it's raining, here it's a great, for instance, there's a pool on the Delaware called Lake Lenore, and it flows south. And if you get a really hard south wind, then it's wind against tide, and you literally get rollers in there like you're on a little ocean. And what happens is it drowns every bug that's emerging. So you got to take that into account in terms of what's going on. What are the trout telling you? You put that together, and then you start catching really good fish, better fish than you've ever caught before. Read those rise forms. Understand what you're looking at. It'll unlock the mysteries for you. The grizzled old guys know a lot about this stuff. And you'll get the trout that'll really make it worth your while. Okay. There's another one we got, again, just under the surface later in the year. All right, guys. That's everything you need to know for fishing the underhatch. There's my my website, fliesforfish.com, my email, jcandflies@charter.net. You can take a picture of it if you like. And the other thing that you can keep in mind is this. I send out a weekly report on river conditions. This time of year, it's not weekly. It is in season. This time of year, I send out some stuff about flies. I'll send out some stuff about products that I thought really helped me during the course of the year. I don't get paid for any of it. And yes, I'll say, okay, I have these dates open in case you're looking to come down. But for the most part, it's just chock full of information. Everything that we see going on the river that might help you understand how to catch more fish. So if you're interested in being added to that mailing list, if you just send me an email and say, hey, do me a favor, add me to the list, I'll be happy to do that. Okay. And now, if you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Let me stop sharing though. I don't want to share. So let me get rid of that. Oh no, I don't want to leave the meeting. All right, I guess we're good here. All right. So I thought I'd have my whole head in the picture, but apparently not. Any questions that I can answer for you guys?
We're looking right now. Anybody got any questions? I can bring the microphone around. Oh, no, what were you gonna say?
What's your typical length of the dropper, Bob? 6 to 8 inches off the main
No.
fly? No.
No, that's very dependent upon the depth of the water you're fishing. So I would say typically I start around the foot, and like one of my favorite holes right outside the hole I learned how to fish on this river, the fish are rising in 6 or 7 feet of water. So I would probably have 18 inches in water that deep. And if I was fishing something more shallow, I might go as short as 8 inches, but typically 12 inches. If you tie it on a dry fly hook, it's not going to sink very much.
No, that's probably fine. Yeah, can you hear me from here?
I can.
Okay, have you ever experimented with color of hook? We had a few because we had some insane days using white spray painted hooks on all our dries and emerger setups, similar to what you fish with. I just didn't know if you ever experimented with that. We found that white worked, chartreuse worked, and then like baby blue. I don't know if it's the reflectance of what they're seeing from their angle, but it seemed to make a difference. I don't know if you ever experimented with that.
There's only
Yeah, no.
there's two things that I feel strongly about with respect to color of hook. The first thing that I feel very strongly about is something a really great fisherman who taught me how to catch fish in the early 1980s taught me. He taught me in like 83, 84. He said to me, fish don't look for negatives, fish look for positives. So if a fish looked for a negative, they would notice the hook every single time and they would refuse it. And maybe some fish have been caught enough that they actually get smart enough to do that. But by and large, fish do not look for negatives. So I believe that. The second thing, and also fish are stupid. People tend to think, oh my God, look at how smart these fish are. No, fish are stupid. Their brain is the size of a pea. The thing about a fish is this: they can only process a limited amount of information. So you get selective behavior because they can only hone in on one or two things at a time. Like for instance, the size. Okay. They can only process that. So they only look for that. They're not like, say, you or me, who could say, oh, look at the 6 different size things on the surface. Oh, that bigger one is better. They'll say, no, this is the one I've been seeing for days. I know this is food. I'm going to take this one. So the first thing is they look for positives. The second thing is this one I'm not as positive about, but I think if you fish like a black hook and it's a light bodied fly, have you ever noticed how that black hook will bleed through and turn the body dark? I think that can turn fish off because you're changing how the color looks. It's not that the hook's there. It's that you're changing the way the body material is perceived by the trout. So if you're fishing like a white hook, I wish I had real white hooks, okay? Because when the sulfurs are out, the hook I love is an Arex 501, an Arex 505, an Arex 521, and an Arex 531. And every one of those hooks are black. So I feel that I have to go to a different colored hook, a lighter colored hook. Otherwise, that black bleeds through. And I can't use my favorite hook on that hatch. So I've actually talked to the Arex people and said, hey, guys, can you make a lighter hook for lighter colored mayflies? I don't seem to be getting very far with my discussion with them. But perhaps what's happening with your white hook and the chartreuse color and the blue is it's enhancing or not harming, as a black hook might, the particular color of dubbing that you use. So that's my guess.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll kick it to them.
So Kyle, when did you what made you come up with this thought? I mean, you did it on the river?
I was just fishing the Delaware every day and wanted to try something different. And yeah, seemed to crack them for a few days, especially on pressured days. But I don't know if there's much to it. I know the white bead, when people started using those on nymphs, that worked, but we had a spray enamel coat paint so you could tie with them in the vise, and it worked pretty good.
Nice. Well, you know what? I love what you said before. We were fishing the Delaware and you just have those days. And that is the truth. The Delaware can be quite challenging. Anything else?
I think that's it, Bob. Yeah.
Well, I
First of
really
all,
appreciate.
yes.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, we can't tell you how much we appreciate this. This is fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Joe. to
Yes,
finish out,
thank you,
but
Bob.
It was outstanding. So
Key
thank
to the
you.
kingdom, I guess.
Thanks. I really do appreciate it. And by the way, I want to thank you guys too, because I was the president of a Trout Unlimited chapter on Long Island, and we did a tremendous amount of stream improvements on the Carmen's River. And I really appreciate and respect the fact that you guys are so committed to trying to enhance the fisheries and the environment for the fish. I think it's a great thing. All right. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again, Bob. Thank you very much. And have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you too, guys.
Right.
Enjoy. Thanks. Take care now. Bye-bye.